Hi, welcome to part 2 of this episode about music and the plague. In this segment, we'll take a close look at Claudio Monteverdi's Gloria for 7 voices to see how it operates, or at least may operate, as a musical depiction of the experience of a plague outbreak. First, though, let's jump right into some of the reasons why I personally believe that this music actually was written to celebrate the end of the Great Plague of Milan in 1631. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it. I'm Peter, and this is We Need to Talk About Music. For one thing, I think there are some strong reasons why Monteverdi may have wanted the music for this particular event to be preserved, simply because of how profound an effect this plague had had on his life. In addition to the death of his friend Strigio, Monteverdi's hometown of Cremona was one of the hardest hit places in Italy, with 60% of the population killed. His other former home of Mantua was sacked by an invading army just when they were going through the worst of the epidemic. Monteverdi and his immediate family seem to have survived, but his former assistant and arguably his chief musical disciple, the underappreciated composer Alessandro Grandi, and presumably many other friends and colleagues, didn't. We also know that Monteverdi made a public vow that if he survived the plague, he would become a priest, which he kinda sorta did, and that he would make a pilgrimage to the town of Loreto, home of what is claimed to be the house where both Jesus and Mary grew up, transported across the Mediterranean by angels. Incredibly, the story that this is actually a house from first century Nazareth, if not necessarily Jesus' house, does seem to check out, although it was more likely transported across the sea by a family named Angelo, rather than by literal angels. Okay, so there's all that. But my main reasons for being so convinced come down to what I hear in the music, which, by the way, is just fantastic. Even if you completely disregard all this plague stuff, I can't recommend highly enough that you check this out. You won't be sorry. To give you a little bit of context, this is a setting of the Gloria, which is one part of the Mass, the most central ritual in the Roman Catholic Church. The Mass is sung, or at least spoken, in every Roman Catholic institution every day. But the Gloria isn't always a part of it. It's basically a song of ecstatic praise, meant to get people hyped. And so it's only brought out on Sundays and holidays, and never ever during times like Lent, when everyone's supposed to be feeling sad and thinking about their sins. The return of the Gloria after these periods is meant to be an important moment that signals to people that it's okay to feel happy again. And this might help to explain why it was given such special attention for a ceremony like this. Musically, this is what people would have called a concerto, which in early 17th century terms basically means that it's music featuring both vocalists and instruments all playing essential roles. Unlike music in the older a cappella style, which could be, but very often wasn't, performed by voices alone. In the world of early 17th century Italian church music, the concerto was the ultimate in modernity. And this one in particular stands out as a sampler of some of the most cutting-edge styles that were around at the time, with a few oddly archaic ones thrown in as well. If you're listening for the first time, this stylistic diversity may be one of the first things you notice. This is music that seems to have a mood swing every few seconds. In a way, this is typical. Monteverdi was a bit of a show-off, and he liked to put as many of his skills on display as he could. But something about the moodiness of it all is a bit more remarkable. The expressivity and drama of this is something that's quite rare in sacred music of this time and place, even from Monteverdi. For a comparison, check out his other standalone Gloria, which features a lot of similarly virtuosic displays of compositional prowess, but does so, to my ear anyway, in a relatively dry, abstract way. The piece begins with the Gloria's opening line, "Glory to God in the highest." Now, normally that probably wouldn't be worth mentioning, but in this case, it kinda shouldn't be there. Traditionally, the opening of the Gloria is just chanted by the priest, something like, "Gloria in excelsis Deo." and it's only with Monteverdi's generation that it started to be typical for composers to write music for it. Appropriately then, Monteverdi uses this section as an ultra-modern display of contrapuntal virtuosity. After opening with a single exposed tenor, singing a clear ascending line, Gloria, Gloria in excelsis Deo, which may be a nod to the tradition, he suddenly drops us into a jaw-dropping musical whirlwind featuring the full choir, which would have been something like 35 singers at the time. He introduces two contrasting quick-time runs, which he then combines and recombines, each time with more power and frenetic energy. This section is notable for sounding an awful lot like music from several generations down the line. You could literally take this and drop it into a Handel oratorio from 100 years later, and it would fit in pretty much perfectly. By that point, this kind of thing had become a bit of a cliché, but what did it sound like to people who had never heard it before? To me, this comes across pretty clearly as Monteverdi's musical depiction of the hustle and bustle and brash hubristic confidence of life in a modern city. Like, for instance, Venice in the spring of 1630. And I feel like my impression is borne out by what comes next. It's the moment that follows, maybe the most memorable thing in a piece full of unforgettable moments, that really convinces me that this is music about the plague. After bringing the opening to an apparently triumphant close, Monteverdi just drops the floor out from under us. Switching from that energetic, hyper-modern style of the first section into a dense, soupy texture that evokes the chromaticism that had been fashionable several decades before, especially for depicting grief. Although, technically, he only gives us one moment of true chromaticism here. He slows the music down to a crawl and drops the pitch, creating the impression that all activity has been suddenly and violently stopped. That feeling of eerie silence and life put on hold by an epidemic isn't something I need to tell any of you about. And it was as common a theme in writings about the plague as it has been in our era. After that intense counterpoint of the opening, now the texture is pretty much homophonic, but individual mournful voices keep emerging from the texture with a descending dissonant figure that creates the impression of sinking further and further into quicksand, and sets up a contrast between the communal shock of an outbreak and the innumerable personal tragedies that make it up. Of course, none of this proves anything. It's entirely possible Monteverdi could have written music like this for another reason, although I have to admit it would strike me as a pretty big coincidence if he had written a special Gloria that reflects the experience of a plague outbreak so eloquently, and it turned out not to be the special Gloria that he wrote to commemorate a plague outbreak. Then Monteverdi makes another left turn, this one maybe even more surprising than the first. After all that gravitas, suddenly two violins enter, playing a bouncy, jaunty little melody. That seems to transport us to some kind of country dance. So what, you might ask, does this have to do with the plague? And that would be a good question, but let's keep listening and see what happens. When the singers enter with that same jaunty little melody, the lines they're singing translate to, "We praise you, we bless you, we adore you." And all this "we" stuff might help to explain why Monteverdi chose this moment to switch into a more folksy kind of style, to reflect the point of view of the people in general. He stays on these lines for a really long time, changing up the melody, even switching into a different time signature at one point, but always keeping that relaxed, dancey vibe and the alternation between violins and small groups of singers. Then he suddenly pulls the rug out from under us again, and ends the section with the musical equivalent of a body being thrown around violently by a storm, over the lines, "Your great glory." Could this be that same story from the opening being retold from a different point of view? Maybe. It's at least an interesting idea to think about. I think it is safe to say that exploring different points of view was something that Monteverdi was interested in when he wrote this. Believe it or not, we're still less than halfway through this piece. It really packs a lot into the 12 minutes or so that it takes to perform it. I won't say much about what comes after, even though most of my favorite parts are really still to come, because I've already talked a lot longer than I intended to. Monteverdi continues to move between dramatically different stylistic areas and to explore that contrast between public and private reactions to a catastrophe. All this leads up, as you might expect it to a triumphant return to that opening hubbub, presumably representing some kind of return to normal, although whether we're intended to take that as an entirely good thing is anyone's guess. A lot of what I've said about Claudio Monteverdi's Gloria for seven voices is really my own personal interpretation, and it just comes down to the way I personally hear the music. You might hear it differently, and you're totally free to take or leave any of this. My only hope is that by giving you a bit of context, especially context that is so relatable to our own recent experiences, I might help give you a jumping off point for your own enjoyment and exploration of a really fantastic piece of music that a lot of you might otherwise never hear. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say, and I especially hope that you enjoy the music. I'll see you again soon when I'll be talking about something completely different. Until then, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.